will end up our private talk here.
Okay.
But nevertheless, I think we will start.
Sure. Okay.
Yes, now it is now 16:15, and we will start. So thank you for joining us. So we end our private talks, but it was good to have it for a bit warming up. And yes, let me introduce Michelle Slack, who is joining us today, and welcome to our third ZeMKI research colloquium this summer. Still on Zoom, but Michelle will join us later in person during hopefully this year or beginning of the next. Most of you know me. I'm Stephanie Alphabet-Leeds, and I'm here a professor in media change. And let me say concerning Michelle Stack that she's an associate professor, a former senior policy advisor also, and a public commentator on education. Her research interests include equity and education, media education, that is also crossing our domain of communication studies and educational studies. Representation of mental health and illness, the role of media and policymaking processes. And her new book, or one of her new writings, is on global university rankings. So a topic which is affecting all of us, if we are students or if we're teachers or as academics, and how do we deal with it? Do we trust in rankings? Is public trusting in rankings? The public. So educational equality also is some of her main topics, media competencies in academia and beyond. And lifelong media education, I read. That was very interesting, not at least now in COVID times, because I would agree that I'm lifelong learning how to deal with media, even as a media scholar. And so media competences in society, now in times of COVID at least, so where we are all much more forced to rely on digital media. And not at least, and we mentioned it in our so-called private talk on Black Lives Matters and on chances and on freedom in academia, in media also, but in academia. And you can read all the title here: Pandemics, Public Intellectuals, Academic Freedom, and Mediatization. So yes, the floor is open for your talk. And yeah.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you for the lovely introduction. And I'm looking forward to physically meeting people at some point. So first I must start with a bit of a confession. The talk I'm going to give is a bit different than the abstract that I provided, and I have a reason for that that I'll get into. The reason that I was going to talk more about celebrity academics, which is an area of research for me, but with the events of COVID and with Black Lives Matter, the murder of George Floyd, I became increasingly interested in how universities, including my own, were suddenly making statements talking about racism and condemning racism. And it seemed that what was interesting to me is that for decades, critical race theorists at top-ranked universities have shared their scholarship concerning the role of racism in universities and in society. Yet that scholarship has largely been ignored. The murder of George Floyd led to statements suddenly appearing on top-ranked university sites. And so what I was interested in is there's substantial scholarship looking at racialization. And so when I talk about racialization, I'm talking about race as a construct and ideas that are attributed to race that often lead to displacement. And institutional racism, and a great deal has been written about this in universities, for example, in terms of how hiring is done or intentional or informal networks tapping on the shoulder that often results in the reproduction of white privilege. So at my university, at UBC, there was immediate statements about condemning racism and supporting Black Lives Matter. But last week, the chair of our, no longer the chair of the board of UBC sent out or retweeted a number of racist tweets comparing Black Lives Matter to the Nazi paramilitary, and a number of other retweets that he made. And what occurred was a debate. A debate on Twitter among many of the scholars at the university, including myself. So first of all, the retweets were found by a group called Students Against Bigotry. They tweeted what they had found. The chair of the board had tweeted. And then what ensued was a debate as to whether he should resign or not, all over Twitter. So what was fascinating to me was that we didn't talk with each other. It was a debate over Twitter and retweeting, etc. And so just how this became, in a sense, a way that also academics were communicating about the governance of their university. So my interest here is drawing on the work done at ZeMKI around demediatization and looking at how universities in particular are very much influenced. And again, what I think is so important about this definition is looking at how the norms of universities, how they communicate and what they communicate becomes very much embedded in norms of branding and marketing. And so how this relates to rankings is that increasingly universities are often in competition. Ranking is very important to them, at least in Canada, the US, and the UK, where I focus a lot of my work. And rankings are primarily based on, or a big part of them are reputation. Just going to go here. So here, sorry. Get used to this. So what I look at, I've been looking at top-ranked universities in mediatization since about 2013. And my interest in this is, there's multiple reasons I'm interested in top-ranked universities. For one, many universities aspire to be top-ranked universities. Governments in much of the world will say to students, we'll pay for you to study abroad, but you have to go to one of the top 100 universities. Many of those universities, although this is changing, are English-speaking, and the top 10 are in the US and the UK. And so I'm interested in this also, that top-ranked universities educate a disproportionate number of political leaders, business leaders, journalists, are educated at these top-ranked universities. In looking at this, I think we need to start by, at first, the simplicity of media logic as one logic, and then looking at how this has become more and more complex, to looking at the impact of neoliberalism and media convergence. At least in Canada, we now have 4 public relations professionals to every journalist. The growth of the education industry, and here I'm talking about how we have a growing industry in terms of recruitment, and also in looking at the connections between rankings, which are usually media-generated products, citation databases that are used by rankings, that are multinational products and often have connection with rankers, and then how this then influences the norms in universities. So for example, fast scholarship, rankings look at research productivity. Academics often, at least in my context, are pushed to publish more and more. And in looking at the connection with other industries like the international student industry as well. I argue this has led to an isomorphism, similarities across top-ranked universities. It's also led to an industry of consultants, consulting universities around the world on how to become top-ranked, how to change their governance, how they hire people, etc., in order to move up in the rankings. And I see this as key to looking at how universities deal with the converging crisis we see in terms of climate change, COVID-19, racism, and rising nationalism. So my interest is looking at how the processes of knowledge production and dissemination change when the organization boundaries between higher education and media become blurred within and across. So I argue that in many ways, when we're looking at, for example, media outlets, legacy media outlets that have had hollowed out newsrooms, at least again in my context, that are more and more reliant on press releases for their news, including press releases from universities. And so looking at what do universities put out to the media? Are they reacting to media stories, or are they trying to frame public conversations? And conversations that might not be conversations that reproduce the current common sense or status quo, but actually challenge it. Okay, so I'm talking about or using the term archaeology of discourses. And in this presentation, I'm going to focus mainly on Harvard, actually entirely on Harvard and Oxford. I have again looked at other universities, but just for the sake of time, this is what I'm going to look at today. So universities are highly differentiated, yet most are under increasing pressure to become highly ranked. Top-ranked universities, as I was saying, also educate a disproportionate number of political, media, and industry leaders. They impact trade and immigration policy. When the university is in service of maintaining capitalism, celebrities are important, which is what I said originally I was going to talk about today. They demonstrate networks of their demonstration of networks of associative capital is key. However, the events of COVID-19 and police brutality, at least in Canada, the US, and UK, have brought to the forefront through protest, social media, and a response, attention from legacy media, questions as to how and what the university stands for. And so understanding how elite institutions tell stories about themselves and their role in society is essential for understanding reproduction, but also spaces of disruption. What I find interesting is you have the discourse of rankings, which is embedded in marketization, in how we categorize people and categorizing knowledge that's in English as higher level, as in terms of how the world university rankings are done. It's connected to assumptions about who is a top knowledge producer and what is top knowledge. That's also embedded in notions of entrepreneurial and particularly a focus on the STEM areas. But at the same time, you have pressure coming from discourses of social justice. So we see the Me Too movement, movements towards decolonizing the curriculum, indigenizing, Black Lives Matter. In Canada, I don't know more around indigeneity. And so you see these discourses that are often in contradiction with each other, but also often don't seem to talk with each other on university websites. And a big part of in terms of how universities are dealing with this is around reputation. So being seen as being equitable, making statements about inclusion, but at the same time, in different places, talking about the language of excellence and research productivity. And so this really interests me in terms of that the university is not one thing, but there's these multiple discourses that are happening. But as I hope I'll show, it's not that the discourses have equal power in terms of what's occurring in universities. Derek Bell, who is often seen as the founder of critical race legal theory at Harvard, talks about how we live in a system that espouses merit, equality, and a level playing field, but exalts those with wealth, power, and celebrity, however gained. And I think that this is central to some of what I'll be looking at here. So I mentioned I'm looking at Oxford and Harvard, so I'm going to start with Oxford. So I looked at Oxford, their press releases, and these are all press releases that I was able, with the very exceptional research assistant of Alison Mustard, to look at their press releases. So we were able to download. And what was interesting was in terms of Oxford press releases, I couldn't find any that talked about racism at Oxford. More likely were issues, there was discussion of diversity, how Oxford was diversifying, and what they were doing in terms of diversity. With the murder of George Floyd, there were some statements by departments, and eventually one by the University of Oxford, condemning racism and stating that they would supported their Black colleagues and students. Conversely, the Oxford student newspaper regularly reports on racism, and I actually found 44 stories looking at racism at Oxford. The Guardian newspaper also wrote 29 articles during that time on racism at Oxford and other elite institutions. And so what's interesting here is we see almost different universities or different planes of reality in terms of what Oxford is, with Oxford students writing a number of pieces versus the official media from Oxford rarely talking about it. And what was interesting is sometimes if there was an article from The Guardian, you might then see a press release from Oxford on diversity, but not directly addressing the issues in the student newsletter, student newspaper, or in The Guardian. So here's some of the statements and press releases from Oxford. Combating racism, what will we do? Anti-racism statements, and a lot, for the most part, statements about how they're boosting student numbers from underrepresented backgrounds. Versus the Oxford student that again taught, Black students tell Oxford, when will you learn? And The Guardian, Black professors. So often it is racialized students and professors that are the ones that call out the racism at Oxford and do so through writing for a paper like The Guardian or sometimes for the student newspaper. So the other thing that I found very interesting in the statements that I looked at a number of universities is how rarely their own scholars were mentioned. So Oxford has critical race scholars, but you don't see them mentioned and you don't see their work mentioned. And so you see sometimes them writing pieces for The Guardian, for example, but you don't see their scholarship taken up by Oxford in terms of how Oxford itself might want to deal with racism in its own institution, or how it might expand larger conversations in society. Here I found it interesting too. The Financial Times had an article on Oxford, how it shaped Brexit and the number of prime ministers, including Boris Johnson, that have been there, and the impact that Oxford has had on current politics. But again, you don't see this referenced on the Oxford website. So Harvard. Harvard had, in terms of their official press releases, they had a bit more, but again, the language was of diversity and inclusion. So it was more about how, we're reaching out to young prospective Black students. We're trying to diversify. So it was more seen as almost a psychological issue of helping these young people know that they can apply to Harvard and Harvard will assist them, rather than looking at issues of institutional racism. I couldn't find official press releases that actually talked about racism at Harvard. There were a number of statements, far more than I found at Oxford, at Harvard, but university, most of the departments and schools and formal university statements condemning racism and pledging to support society and support the Harvard community in dealing with racism. Again, there were a number of articles. Actually, here it's interesting. I mean, there were quite a few articles in the student newspaper, the Crimson, about racism, some about racism of the police, the Harvard police. Not as many as Oxford, but there were quite a few. And then in the New York Times, there were also a number of articles about racism at Harvard, and sometimes it was racism at Harvard and other elite schools. Yeah, I'm probably getting ahead of myself here. In terms of the statements, just to go back a bit, the nature of the statements, just in terms of Oxford, it was often the language of, well, much has been done by many committed people. We acknowledge we haven't done enough. So there was often language of good people and good intentions, and not so much in terms of talking about institutional racism. Okay, what was interesting to me is looking at the websites of Oxford and Harvard. As I said, I've been looking at them since 2013. When I looked at them then, they were almost all white, predominantly male. So knowledge producers were represented as white and male. Sometimes there would be images, representations of Black people, but usually as beneficiaries of knowledge from predominantly white academics. 5 years, when I looked at the Harvard website, for example, in 2017, there was one of the main stories was Zuckerberg, Facebook, speaking at Harvard. Most of the images were of white celebrities. But after the murder of Floyd, almost all the images were of Black academics and students. So it changed overnight with the media attention. So you see also images of Black faculty and administrators. Again, though, it's interesting in looking at, I went to both Harvard and Oxford have sites for journalists. And so in looking at Oxford's, I looked at the list they gave of what they see as current and continuing interest to journalists in the university community. And you'll see here the list. And so issues of equity don't place very highly on the list. So there's often what's interesting is the placement of where things are on a website. And so what is one able to easily find on the Harvard website or the Oxford website, and what does one have to really look for? Again, in 2017, Harvard had a conference acknowledging the role of slavery in the development of Harvard. And so this is something that's really important to look at in terms of top-ranked institutions that were, for the most part, gained their wealth, like Harvard, through the enslavement of Black people. And so in looking at Harvard, that's been a huge push of student activists and faculty activists for decades, is to get Harvard to at least to acknowledge how they gain their wealth. And so here there's a conference that the president of Harvard acknowledges the role of universities, or the connection of universities to slavery. But again, it's often talked about as historical, and the representation of Harvard to the event versus the representation of the students is quite different. So here, moving up to the present, you again have a number of deans and others talking about how Harvard will do better. But again, like Oxford, often the focus is on the progress Harvard has made. And the languages of inclusion and belonging, of inspiration, rather than language of racism or institutional racism. So there's a focus on, for example, images of diversity or progress. There's often language of progress. Here the Crimson, conversely, goes at Harvard very directly, talks about their investigation, including the police and racism within the institution. As does the New York Times. And here again, we see that the Harvard website, it does mention Black academics after the murder of George Floyd, but for the most part, we don't see much mention of Black academics and an erasure of the internationally recognized scholarship of academics like Derek Bell, who left Harvard, I believe it was in the 90s, after protesting repeatedly the lack of hiring of Black and women faculty. And so, here we often see the erasure. You really have to look for that information in terms of the role of these academics and students in bringing Harvard to some of the changes that they have made. So they have hired, there are now a number of deans of color, for example. But we don't see the sort of decades of work that scholars and students have done to push for some of those changes. So, for example, it was students that pushed to change the logo of the law school, which was the logo was an image of a slave owner. And students fought again for decades to have that logo changed. So their activism is largely erased in much of the media. That how Harvard represents itself and represents its commitments to diversity and equity. So it's like they've done this, but not looking at the struggle that it took to do that. The struggle often of Black academics and students to get Harvard to that point. So in looking at the framing and the spatial politics of the stories at Oxford and Harvard, first I looked at the university press releases to journalists. And what I found at both universities is there's often a focus on using their wealth for equity. So we're going to use money to set up scholarship programs for disadvantaged or for Black youth or for mentorship. There's a focus on diversity using language of branding. And so if I look at higher ed marketing journals that talk about the need to show it's a belonging and inclusive place, we see a lot of that language on the websites and the press releases of these two universities. In looking at what information is easy to find, right? So information about excellence, information about notable academics tends to be pretty white and male. So there's, whereas information about equity is in a different section of the website. Timing, so in looking at university statements and websites, again, often there's statements about racism as an issues management strategy. So when a university is accused of racism, when there's a lawsuit, then there's statements decrying or condemning racism. But it's episodic, and this is what I think is really, really key, is that it seems like the universities are responding to systemic issues in an episodic way, similar to journalists. And so there's a politics of forgetting, in a sense, of rather than looking at systemic issues like racism, they're reported as episodic, as an event. And that event is then reported in media, and it's reported on the websites of universities without attention to scholarship, and including scholarship of their own academics. Another thing I noticed was a distancing. And so in looking at the university websites, they talk often about racism as something out there. We at universities, can help society heal. Here's the work that we do, right? Rather than racism as something that's internal to the institution. And when it's talked about as institutional, it tends to be a focus on interpersonal racism or overt racism. So things like, we have zero tolerance for racism. We have zero tolerance for discrimination. So it's talked about more as an interpersonal issue, as something that will be dealt with through a complaint process. There's a lot of discussion of good intentions as well. So when we look at university press releases, we also, sorry, too impatient. When we look at university press releases and statements, we don't see an author. Right, so they're written as objective, in a sense. There is no author to them. Now, when we look at student media, we see more sustained attention to issues of racism, more focus on proximity. So in looking at racism internal to their institution, and definitely more calling out in terms of saying, we need to look at racism in our own institution, in our own lives, and how to challenge and disrupt that. Similarly, in looking at newspapers, again, I just looked at the Guardian, New York Times, there is a critique of university spin and larger issues around elite universities. Now, this is not to say that media are better at dealing with and acknowledging institutional racism. it could be their distancing as well. It's easier to talk about other institutions than to talk about their own. So if I was to look at the Guardian, New York Times, and how often do they write about racism in their own organizations, I may have very similar data to what I have here in terms of the universities. The authors, and I think this is really key, is the authors are often racialized people themselves. And so it really gets at what is the responsibility, who is made responsible for dealing with racism and for dealing with white privilege and white supremacy. And sorry, the other I think is interesting is to look at just what violence is okay to talk about and what violence is not okay to talk about and when. And so looking at why was it not okay to talk about police brutality and this level of violence previously in terms of the kinds of conversations that universities pushed out to media. But also in looking at Oxford, for example, they recently had the student election has been challenged because of racism, particularly towards Palestinians, the racism of a presidential candidate. And so again, the coverage of that, there was some coverage of that in the Crimson, but still pretty minimal coverage. So here is, in a sense, and I just want to go to my notes here because this part I really was trying to think how to end on not an optimistic note, but in a sense, there is a tragedy, I think, is that the knowledge is there. There's knowledge that racism has a hideously negative impact. But the current political economy of higher education, including rankings and larger forces of marketization, make finding spaces to go beyond reputational politics in a sustained and structural manner to push back on racist discourses inside and outside the university, at least in the context I'm looking at, is extremely limited. And I think this is, in looking at Harvard and Oxford, we see different planes of reality. The university students, press releases, student media, and papers of record. We see an archaeology of discourses that coexist and are contradictory. Each party reaches its own view, but there's little evidence of interaction between them. For example, there are student reports and reports by university administrators, or perhaps a task force. There's occasionally investigative reporting by legacy media or policymakers. They operate on different planes. Statements from universities rarely invoke the scholarship of their own faculty, students, and staff who do work in the area. In other words, anti-racism is balkanized, each in their own particular domain, which disconnects knowledge generated in the university from its transformative public potential. Questions of racism fall between the cracks. Students and press speak about racism, but there's little direct engagement and a dialogue that might have a transformative value with the university. Official discourses mainly foster public relations and leave structures of the university habits of mind that reproduce the status quo. And so this was really fascinating to me, was the focus on the language of public relations in much of the communication of the university. And if we look at some of the debates, for example, right now, a really heated debate at Oxford is the tearing down of statues of particularly brutal colonizers like Cecil Rhodes, are really indicative of just how trapped universities are within their own histories. Understanding this is central to analyzing the many university leaders who express personal commitment to anti-racism, but appear to make little progress at the level of structural change. Left untouched in the official responses of Harvard and Oxford is what is the science in which we organize society? How do we redeem ourselves from enslaved colonialism and white supremacy? And how can we disentangle to start looking inward at our own institutions and how institutions represent themselves through various media channels? So I think that the websites, the statements, and the press releases of Harvard and Oxford should be seen within larger configurations of power. Oxford is part of the elite group of universities. These structures need to be seen within the education industry and emerging global governance models of higher ed that entrenched notions of English as a language of scholarship and top-ranked universities as objectively determined through universalist criteria of what a good education is, and from this assumption, how higher education should operate and how their members should behave. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Michelle. And I think we open the floor for some other questions, voices, comments, and maybe you shut the screen. Then I would better.
Sorry. I thought I shut it before by accident. Sorry.
Would be maybe easier to see the people.
Yeah, great.
That's great.
Nice.
Then we can. Then we can go better into the discussion or questions. So the floor is open. Who has some questions or comments at the moment? Yes, Sigrid?
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Michelle, for this very timely presentation. It was great to get an insight there, also into your research and also in the material. I was wondering, when I listened to you, what was obvious were the relevance, of course, of race and also of gender that you explained. Can you elaborate a little bit on the relevance of class? Because that's something that would interest me, especially because of the examples of the universities that you were focusing on.
Yeah, now that's something here I was looking mainly at how universities are responding to Black Lives Matter and COVID. But yes, I mean, this is a really interesting thing about top-ranked universities that I've looked at previously is they're wealthy. I mean, that is, so often I think wealth and intellectual contribution are conflated. So the social class of those who attend Harvard and Oxford is predominantly middle and upper class. They have very few lower income socioeconomic students. And similarly with faculty, right? As you seem to have, there's a pipeline in terms of where faculty do their PhD and where they end up getting tenure. And so, so social class plays a very central role, and where you do see it is the language of around diversity is we're helping disadvantaged students, but not conversation about some of the systemic issues are also who's seen as a sort of top knowledge producer and what knowledge is taught. There was at Harvard, there was a recent case of a professor that was denied tenure, and a number of the students complained, saying she was one of the few people they could talk to. She was a scholar of color, but also somebody from a lower socioeconomic status, family status. And so there was a bit of news about her, but that's a really important question.
And
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I assume that it's not critically reflected upon. So it is acknowledged, class is acknowledged as a kind of also when advertising for the universities.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point too. So this whole notion of internationalization, right? It's like which students? I often have, it's like, yes, I think international education is great. But if you look at which students are able to go to Harvard and Oxford in terms of international students, they're mainly middle to upper class because the fees are so huge, right? And so no, that's not critically reflected in what I've looked at within the Harvard or Oxford media that they produce. It is reflected in The Guardian to some extent. The Guardian has done a few pieces on social class and elite institutions, particularly what's called the Russell institutions.
Thanks.
Yeah. Any other comments or questions? Lisa?
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. It is an absolutely fascinating topic, and I'm really glad I had the time today and join this interesting presentation. And I was wondering, when we talk about other topics of diversity and discrimination, is religion an issue? or is it something that people talk about in any way? Probably not in the statements, but is it something maybe in the student newspapers? Yeah, that would be interesting if you know something about that.
That would be really interesting, and I have to admit that's something I haven't looked at. I mean, I've looked at a bit in terms of media coverage in terms of Islamophobia, and but I haven't looked at that in relation to the rankings. That would be very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
That'd be a good project.
Yes. Others, if not, I also have a more or less direct question on that, because you said that yes, now you research Harvard, and so the top ranked. And what do you think if you would go to more regional university, not Ivy League and so on? Would it be another talk?
Yeah,
because there's not such need to represent tradition or whatever.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think what's interesting is how huge the ranking industry has become. So you have, over 20 that would consider themselves international rankings, but then you have over 100 regional rankings or national rankings. And so what I would say is that you still have a branding, marketing sort of focus of regional universities in many places as well. But what they might focus on is different. So it might be teaching, for example. We're the top ranked in terms of teaching, or are often the top ranked in terms of things like amenities. And so, at least in the States, it was a really big issue is fancy dorms, lazy rivers, entertainment, etc. on campuses as a way to recruit students. So you would maybe see different metrics that are used, but I think you'd still see a focus on branding, and the language of branding is part of marketization. For universities that do see themselves as getting into, for example, QS or the Times Higher Ed, they have world university rankings, but then they have regional rankings. And so what you would see is universities, for example, in India or in parts of Africa that might not see them. They might say, okay, we're not going to get in the top 50 world, but we'll get into the regional rankings. And a lot of the same logics would apply. Yeah. So I think you would see some. And there's also like QS stars for people. Universities pay to get evaluated and get a QS star. And again, it would be QS or telling them what metrics to use in order to be able to achieve that. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, yeah. Other comments or questions? Nina, I think.
Yeah, sorry, I had to find out how to turn the microphone back on. Thanks so much for the talk. It was really interesting. What struck me a little bit was the similarity of impression that I had between the press releases of the universities and more so of language of press releases that you would see from a company. So I was wondering if there's maybe a bit of a comparison there, or if they just if they just apply branding strategies that have worked on companies now to universities, or if there's still a difference between how companies and universities do this kind of stuff.
Thank you so much for that question, because I forgot to say that in the presentation. I had it in my notes. So really good point. And yes, there is some very much a similarity. And if you look at like marketing journals, our newspapers for higher ed, again, it's a huge sector, one that's estimated to be worth $4.4 trillion internationally. And so, yeah, you see very similar language to what you would see, for a car company around diversity and inclusion and equity, but not language around structural oppression. So the language is quite similar, I'd say. But I haven't done I would like to do a more detailed, nuanced analysis of that. But in terms of the advice that you see in marketing newspapers for the education industry, you see the PR strategies of the universities I've looked at as following those quite closely.
One comment on that. A French colleague of mine, Sarah Cordonnier of the University of Lyon, she has analyzed internationalization strategies and the narration of those strategies on university websites in France. It is not so much a diversity topic, but it's more, we get international, but she had exactly the same, also via discourse analysis, the same finding, that the language of marketing is and this language of representing the university mix, and that would be interesting to look on it more historically, as you've done in your timeline of it. When was this point, or is it something which we had been to be more cautious, because maybe that is still since a long time that talk? I'm not so sure. I reflected if there are some historical work on that for Germany, for example, but I do not know anything.
There is some, like, I think that what's interesting is the language of internationalization, for example. You know, you do see, I think, a change with neoliberalism, where you have, in many places, universities dealing with large cuts from public funding. And so to make up for those public cuts in funding, they move to international students. And, you know, international, here in Canada, for example, there's not a federal ministry of education. International students are often treated under trade, right? They're you know, so it's a large industry. So you see universities, and in Canada, actually even K-12, making up public shortfalls in funding through international students, but also through a growing relationship with industry to fund research, particularly in STEM areas. So I think that there has been changes that have become more intensified, and rankings are part of that. I mean, I see rankings as part of the education industry that's very much connected to international student mobility as well. I don't know if that kind of, and looking at websites, I mean, one thing I noticed was just how similar, for example, when I started looking at websites in India of ITTs that are quite highly ranked, they were very different than the websites of, let's say, Oxford or Harvard, but it became more similar. Same with top-ranked universities in China. So you start to see a similarity in even layout of websites and the type of focuses.
And what do you advise to us as academics living in that environment, how to be critical on our own universities? Yeah,
I mean, I think part of it is just, you know, I know when I started looking at rankings, I mean, I was asked to do a presentation because I look at media and policy, and I was stunned. I mean, I you know, clapped in meetings when the dean would, this was a long time ago, would talk about how we're up in the rankings. It's like, okay, that's great, nice little ego boost. And I was stunned at how rankings have really little to do, actually nothing to do with academic debates about what a good education is or what good research is. I mean, it really is about you know, logics of branding and media. And so I think part of it is that awareness, and part of it is and I think in many ways Germany has been at the forefront of some of this, is fighting back on some of the uses, for example, of Elsevier and how companies like that increase the cost of knowledge. But it's very hard for universities to say, hey, we're not going to play with them anymore. Because they're so key to other parts of the industry like rankings. So I think just knowing that they're interconnected, but also, I mean, I guess my main answer is academic solidarities, is that academics, we need to be talking more across national contexts, and top-ranked universities and academics, I think, to deal with the cognitive dissonance of speaking constantly about how we're at top-ranked universities, knowing that has nothing to do with that how that we got there has really little to do with knowledge. And so, I mean, I'm at a top-ranked university, and I constantly have university administrators saying to me, yeah, we agree that the rankings are nonsense, but we need to use them to make money. And so they're all over our websites. I think we need to challenge that kind of cognitive dissonance. What is our role as universities if we're willing to perpetuate that kind of false information in ways that I think make it harder for academics to actually engage in difficult public conversations and to initiate public conversations based on scholarship.
There was another person, Sigrid, and then Andreas.
Yeah, thank you. I think a follow-up question, or maybe you have already answered it. I don't know. I just posed the question. It's focusing on the relation between academics, PR departments of the universities, and media. So even though it was not in the focus of the project that you presented, but from what you presented, in how far do you think these processes between PR managers of universities and so they publishing press releases, media then covering these issues, in how far are academics actually involved, or isn't it just a bubble in which PR, the PR department of the universities are involved and the media, and then it has not really to do anything with what the academics are actually doing at universities. Because what we have, the discourse we have at the moment in Germany is also regarding COVID-19, that science communication gets so much more important, and that finally the public acknowledges the importance of science and the relation between media and science. But I think that in the end, nothing will really change, because it's also a very tiny part of science that actually gains in importance now. So what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I did do a study interviewing PR directors at one point and started looking at what their role is. And I think, I do think that in many ways, the discussions universities have with the public often are hollowed out scholarship or scholarship that's used to react to stories that have already been framed by the media. Although, I would say there's work academics can do in that. I mean, one would be, and I see in some places a move towards this, academics saying we want to be on advisories or be with, the public relations people to talk more about how to promote scholarship. Something I find quite hopeful is the conversation. It's called the Conversation. There's one in Canada, I think there's one in the UK, and it's basically funded by different universities, and it's journalists working with academics. So I've written for them quite often, and I'll write my piece. A journalist will work with me to write it in a way that will be picked up by media, but it's my research. I have final say in whether it goes or not, including the title and everything else. That I see as a really hopeful model, because I think the role of journalists is really important, particularly in helping academics communicate to audiences that they may not have a whole lot of experience in communicating with. And so I think there's a real benefit and need for people with journalistic storytelling abilities to help academics often in communicating their work to policymakers. But there needs to be that connection. And I do think right now there's too much of a disconnect between public relations and academics, and it often becomes focused on branding, focused on rankings and reputation. And so you certainly see, when I've seen this at my university and others, when there's violence on campus, when there's sexual violence on campus, is, wanting to focus on it being a safe campus or on progress, and not really looking at the root of the problem and what needs to, and the conversations that need to happen in a sustained sort of way. I don't know if that answers your...
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I do see some hope if academics get more involved in pushing back a bit and saying we want to be involved in this in terms of the public relations strategies.
I think the next one is Andreas.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot, Michelle, for your presentation. I think it's a topic we all are struggling with on various levels, so it's really good to reflect that. I have 3 points. One is just a simple question, because I'm not sure if this was addressed in your project. And this is the level of algorithms when it comes to the rankings. So did you also focus on that? Maybe partly also when it comes to racism.
Yeah.
So how far these algorithms have particular patterns of reproducing racism. This would be my first question. The second one is, well, how can I put it? I mean, maybe it makes it even more complicated. But so the point I want to make is that within all the process you were describing, we have, from my point of view, a further kind of transformation. And this is the transformation that the role of us as academics, at least if you reach a certain senior level, has changed. So all of us are somehow active in social media. All of us have quite deep networks into journalism. All of us are somehow positioned in debates when they are related to their own research area, and so on and so on. Which I think, which is related to a much bigger shift. And this is, how can I put it? As social media or as platform have changed the relation between journalism and the audience, it has changed the relation between the PR departments and the audiences, and it has changed the relation between us as senior academics and the public and the audience. So in a certain way, I think the example you started with a Twitter debate on this particular issue, for me somehow represents more what's going on, and maybe even the PR departments lose partly their role, or get a new role in the sense, okay, they do branding for new students who are so focused that they just look on the webpage, but a real debate takes place in other kind of media. Question mark. So if I put it to a question, how would you contextualize your arguments in such issues of a further changing media environment? Maybe this is the best way to put it as a question. The third question is again a simple one. If I would ask you for a good practice model, so a university where you'd say, well, they do it well, what good practice model might you know?
Great, thank you. Okay, so in terms of algorithms, really important question. I know Kathy O'Neill has written about that in terms of weapons of math destruction, and written a bit about it in terms of rankings. Definitely, in particular in looking at research productivity and how articles are, how that is determined, needs further investigation, and finding out what the algorithms are, obviously, is very difficult, right? And so that's a real issue, is that the rankings appear to be this objective number, yet do we really know how the algorithm is used and what gets spit out, and then how universities are ranked, and the very huge impacts on the university that's ranked number 100 versus 101, right? I mean, there's very big impacts in terms of student numbers and funding from philanthropy, etc. So that's a really important question. On racism, I haven't looked at algorithms and racism directly. I've certainly read research on it. I mean, years ago, I was interviewing journalists, and every journalist I interviewed, I said, how do you define research? And every one of them said Google. And so I asked, once, I had to do a story once on avian flu, and I Googled it and I did the story, and then all these doctors were mad at me. And I was like, well, it was the first result on Google, right? That's what I trusted. So I think this is a huge issue, and it's a huge issue in terms of how research is defined and what's used and what can then be reproduced. In terms of, your question around social media. So yes, what I would say is we have multiple planes of reality right now in terms of what do policymakers look at, who still frames the debate. I think we still do have to look at legacy media. We still have to look at what universities put out about themselves. So I do think that influences academics, how they see their role, how prospective members of the university might see their role, and also what message is being sent to academics about what your role is, what your brand is, and how you're being asked to encompass the brand of your institution. So I think that material is important. However, I totally agree with you on social media, and I actually have a couple of students looking at this, an MA student named Ji-Won looking at this in terms of how the university brands through the Facebook page, for example, to international students. And so I think that is really key. in that environment, you have academics that then become liabilities and assets. And so, the academic that is an asset in terms of whether they encompass the brand of their institution, whether on Twitter or not, or whether they're seen as disruptive. Where I think this is important is also in looking at how these can be spaces of intervention or spaces for academics to push for a different kind of university. They can also be spaces of surveillance. So if we look at Zoom, for example, that there was a recent case of academics that had, I think it was an academic originally from Hong Kong that had her Zoom account shut for protests around Tiananmen Square that are not allowed in China, right? And so we do have to look at this too in terms of these spaces where we can have conversations, but also can be spaces of surveillance. So to answer your question, I don't think there's any simple, is it the new reality? I think that the reality is so multifaceted in terms of old, legacy media still mattering in terms of setting the parameters of the debate. But yes, social media being key as a place of disruption, but also one of surveillance. So a constant need for those that are trying to disrupt, trying to create universities as more equitable institutions, to know that they're constantly going to have to change tactics. And so in terms of a practice model, I would say, again, to me, a practice model would be one that never stays static, because there's always going to be co-opting. so it's, it always just has to move and say, okay, Zoom is working great now, now it's being taken over, let's find something else. And similarly with Twitter, if I look at, people that I've had last week, saying, I had a number of people saying, well, I'd like to engage in this conversation, but I'm too scared to, I'm not a tenured academic, and so I think knowing that people are differently positioned in these debates, like Twitter, for example, where some academics may feel very comfortable and others are not, because they're racialized, because they're not tenured, etc. So to look at those issues. So I don't have a practice model other than it can't be static.
Thanks.
Yes, thanks a lot. Are there other questions or comments? So I wanted also to add that for me it was great to see you're rooted more in educational studies, and here are a lot of people also from educational studies, but also from communication studies, and that is really a transdisciplinary talk. And only one hint for communication studies, maybe there was an article by Paola Chakravarti on communication studies so wide, where all those topics which are really affecting not so much a PR, a superficial thing, but our life as academics, when you see they made citation analysis and they find out that in our field of communication studies, it is what you said, it is male, white, middle class citation as a kind of structural problem, because I think it is not something which the people choose so much, but it is because it is, you cite this and not this, and you read this and not this. Yeah. That's also a problem.
It's interesting in looking at the Nobel Prize. I did a paper on this looking at rankings and celebrity academics. I was looking at Nobel Prize winners, 96% of which are male, almost are white male. But what's interesting is the small number of institutions that they did their that they where they were when they got their prize, right? So it's mainly in New York, California, Massachusetts, right? So in looking at the role of friendship networks in prizes that are seen as objective, right? So how do friendship networks actually are collegial, how do they influence citation practices and award practices? I think it's really key, and that can actually then influence things like rankings.
Yeah. So I do not see anyone now who wants to comment something, and I will be really happy to see you then in person.
That'd be great.
Soonly, hopefully, if this COVID crisis will be hopefully better. And yes, so we enjoyed your talk, and